Just before you watch this, know that the situation is changing. And by the time this comes out, things may look quite different for the Georgian theatre. So think of this as some background and maybe some context for the issue of theatre funding in Barrie moving forward. Sharing the voices of those impacted by the closure of the Georgian theatre and sharing some ways in which the situation might move forward. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, theatres across Canada have sat quiet. And that's just as you might expect. Live theatre might seem like a distant memory in the days of lockdowns, physical distancing, and COVID protocols. But Barrie's theatre community and the community that uses the Georgian theatre didn't just pack up shop in 2020. They've been planning, pivoting, and planning again, getting ready for 2021, 2022, when life can go back to a certain kind of normal. And many were very excited about getting back into the Georgian theatre, which has been their home for decades. That's why it came as even more of a shock when they found out a couple weeks ago that Barrie's most suitable theatre location for a lot of productions was shutting down. In the last week of February, it was announced that the lease on the Georgian theatre would be cancelled. And that saves the city around $300,000 a year in expenditures. As you can imagine, it was part of the City Council's push to lower the tax rate for this coming year. But that news sent shockwaves through the Barrie community that uses the Georgian theatre and that attends shows there as well. From musical theatre companies to acting troupes to contemporary dance, the space has long been a gathering point for Barrie's arts community. And since the Fisher Auditorium was also voted to be demolished and a suitable replacement won't be around for probably more than 6 years, Barrie had no suitable alternative for these large-scale productions that need certain backstage options, lighting setups, and more that other spaces like the Sadlin Centre just don't have. But outrage turned to action. A petition began, and multiple groups in the community that uses the Georgian, including the Kempenfelt community players and Theatre by the Bay, met to discuss a path forward. And last Monday, Barrie City Council voted to apply for funding for a possible grant that would help make the Georgian usable in the interim, possibly this year. And don't forget, the council has approved a theatre fund with $2.5 million being siphoned in annually from the Reserve Investment Fund. But this doesn't guarantee a space anytime soon. So Barrie's performing arts community was caught in a bind, how to plan for a post-pandemic world without any suitable alternative space. Without the input of Angela Baldwin, who was the one who suggested the city apply for the grant, the Georgian could very well be a distant memory. Now, with a possible grant allowing for extended use and an outpouring of support across Barrie, it looks like there might be some hope. For more, I spoke with Ian Moggach. He's the artistic director of Theatre by the Bay. I'll let him introduce himself, and then we dive into the crazy few weeks for theatre in Barrie, what happened, how the discussion has evolved, and what theatre and performing arts spaces might look like in Barrie in the future.
Sure. So my name's Ian Moggach, and I'm the artistic director of Theatre by the Bay. So I'm responsible for all the artistic programming that happens at the company, as well as fundraising and general management as well.
And I definitely want to touch on how the company has adapted to the pandemic later on, but I guess I'll start most recently. And from what I hear, it's been a pretty crazy past week. Could you kind of walk me through the moment from when you heard the news that the Georgian was closing up until now, as in the organization that's been happening behind the scenes and kind of everything as the situation has been evolving?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you said, it's kind of crazy. Like, so much has happened, but basically we received we received an announcement at a meeting of the theater groups with the manager of culture and recreation, Rob Bell, and it took us a little bit of time to kind of like absorb that. And then the news started breaking to the community that this had happened. There was an article in Barrie Today, and that really rallied up the entire community because of the fact that the Georgian is such an important lifeblood for the performing arts community in Barrie. So, we started sending out emails, blah, blah, blah. And then when the actual article broke, there was a lot of information that was missing. from our perspective as well, that I felt needed to be brought up. So I posted on my Facebook page, my personal Facebook page, a big account of what had happened from behind the scenes. So the lack of consultation, the fact that staff had had many opportunities to tell us that this was going to happen before it was revealed to us, and they chose never to, and that the perception was just that simply this was a done deal, and just what that meant. So after that huge response, from the community, CAO Prouse released a letter which included a lot of nice sentiments about arts and culture, and some of the practical reasons for why the decision had to be made, and that was a great launching point for then us to mobilize again and come up with a counter response. So drawing from some of his points about the cost of operating the theater, the requirements for renovation going forward to make sure that it's up to par, I guess, like all these kinds of points were actually quite easily dissectable and actually raised a lot more questions than they answered. So that led to the community getting together and coming up with a response. So last Friday, there was a community meeting where we got together a couple action points that we wanted to see in response to this letter. And there was also a gathering of local arts leaders as well, like the leaders from several of the major organizations in town that were impacted by the decision. And we came up with kind of just a unified message that we would then take back to the city. And the city, has now received that, and the conversation is ongoing. At the same time, a local community member, Angela Baldwin, who is a member of the Barrie Film Festival, was involved with Theatre by the Bay for a long time. She realized that there was actually granting opportunities that might assist in covering some of these expenses that the city was saying was the reason that it had to close. It was the reaction from the city was like, oh, well, that's great, we can totally do that, when in fact, from my perspective, it's like you didn't think about applying for a grant. But anyway, so the several members of staff from both of the departments that span culture got together with a few arts leaders, said that this was the plan going forward. They got permission from council to then pursue this grant, and just in the last few days, we've been working on this grant collectively, to assist the city in that application to make sure that we can cover some of those costs. So long story because there's so many moving parts, but that's kind of the core of it.
And I don't want to ask you to be like a representative for all the people involved, I guess, in Theatre by the Bay. But as far as you personally, how were you feeling when you first heard the news about the future of Theatre by the Bay and the future of theatre in Barrie? And how are you feeling now?
For Theatre by the Bay, we've managed this pretty well. I mean, we're a theater company that is very focused on local artist development, developing new work about the community. So this has actually kind of been a time for us to double down on that and really utilize the time well, so that way going into the future, we're prepared for success. The loss of the Georgian Theater is a huge puzzle piece, though, because that's the location where we typically do our Big Stars Come Out gala, which is a really important fundraiser for the company. So not having that until potentially 2026, when the Fisher Building is completed, if the Fisher Building is completed by that point, really throws a wrench in how we can fundraise. And so that's a bit of a problem. In terms of the theater community in Barrie, I mean, it's always been underfunded. It's always been, there's always been a lack of venues in general, just because, well, rent is extremely high, and there's a lot of systemic factors that are prohibitive for new companies to sprout up, for instance. So yeah, losing the Georgian just is another cut into this pool that is really struggling. So what it looks like for the future is to be determined, I guess, but I can't imagine it getting easier for more theater to be made for the foreseeable future.
And with the news of this grant, and at City Council, they thanked Angela by name, and it seemed like a lot of councillors were really on board with this. Do you feel hope in terms of getting this grant going, or in terms of finding some sort of stopgap solution?
I don't know yet. I don't know yet. I mean, the cost, like the numbers that they were floating in terms of what would be required to get the Georgian operating again seem to be all over the place. Like I've heard everything from, well, we need $50,000 in immediate funding to do the minimum requirement of repairs to get it open again, but then also this 1.3 million number has been floated. So I don't know. I it's to be determined, but I think though actually my hope comes from the fact that this has really demonstrated to the city that there is a large community of people that really care about arts and culture, and the fact that Mayor Lehman, for instance, went on the radio and said, yep, this was a huge oversight, this was a big problem, councillors made this decision without a lot of consideration. Like these sorts of steps are important, and hopefully as a community and as a community that's attempting to work with the city to improve arts and culture in the area, that this can be kind of like a watershed moment where things get better. But really the ball is in their court to deliver on that. They know what the arts and culture community needs. They know that there's a lot of people that want to make it happen. They know that I'm accessible on my cell phone any time of the day if they want to talk to me about anything. But it's up to them now to make the solutions happen, from my perspective.
And you mentioned right off the bat, in response to CEO Prowse's letter, you said it raised a lot of questions. Could you talk about some of the questions that letter, but also the whole handling of the situation has raised for you?
Sure. So, I mean, part of this thing. Okay, so here's a good example. So, in his letter and in the article that was published that highlighted some of the points of his letter, he brought up that there were only 30 bookings of the Georgian last year. Well, that raises a question because last year was 2020 and 30 bookings, and the theater was completely shut down in March, right? So that's only 2.5 months of potential bookings, and there were 30 bookings in that time. And then if you look at, and in contrast, for instance, if you look at 2018 or 2019, there might have been 50 to 60 bookings over the course of the year that spanned more than 160 to 180 days. So it's a little disingenuous for them to say, oh, well, there was only 30 bookings at the Georgian last year without acknowledging the rest of the story behind that. So that kind of language I found quite problematic. And also just, the fact that, that they're so committed to arts and culture and yet couldn't put any consideration into what this sort of impact would be by like talking to us first about it. The fact that a member of the community had to go to them and say, hey, there are grants that might assist you guys with this, and them go, oh, well, what a great idea. Like this is kind of this is problematic, and it speaks to a lack of communication. So the letter I felt was very filtered, and also included a lot of lip service without any actual commitment to action to make the situation better. Just as an example.
I suppose in council conversation, and I believe in that letter too, if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of language about the reason it was done in this fashion, the reason it was done so quickly was a lot because of the attempt to cut costs in a year like this and lower the tax rate. I was wondering, going forward, how do you want to see your council interact more holistically and interact more genuinely with the arts community in these kind of decisions?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's a few approaches, but the main one that I am really pushing for is the establishment of an official arts and culture committee. So this includes council members, staff, members of the artistic community, working together, being accountable to each other, being able to work in a collaborative fashion. So that way, problems like, hey, you guys just canceled the Fisher building and now you're going to pull the lease on the Georgian. What are we going to go do in the interim? And instead of creating these like stopgap solutions, like, well, we can add a big curtain to the Sadlin Arena, we could actually work together to make things happen. And I think that will provide the transparency, that will provide the communication, that will provide, the feeling that we're working together, as opposed to kind of this is it's the arts community versus city hall, that the community's really been calling for, and I think would be a really proactive step. So that's a big one. I think as well, the city of Barrie also has a cultural granting funding program, and this has been very underfunded for a long time, considering the size of the city that it's in. I mean, last year I think it was in the $380,000 range, which is nothing. That is like less than like a dollar, on your taxes. Like, it's crazy. So I think a serious investment in the cultural grant funding, especially for organizations that are trying to get started in this area, I think would be a hugely significant step towards reconciliation and collaboration.
And there are people in the Barrie community on Facebook or Twitter or whatever that may be of the opinion that, especially in a pandemic, city council shouldn't be focusing its attention on arts when we can't even hold live performances, or that city council should be focusing its money and time on other industries. Why do you feel like the arts industry and the theater industry in particular is so important to keep funded and keep going in Barrie?
Well, I mean, what has been the silent pandemic in this whole thing? It's been mental health. It's been the lack of community. It's been the inability to gather with people, and theater does provide that. And yeah, sure, in some cases we may not be able to gather at the Five Points Theater, say, but there are all sorts of avenues. We've seen this across the entire world by this point. We're a year into this pandemic. Like, there's so many models that could be drawn from in terms of how organizations and a community can deliver live theatrical experiences. But it's just, they have to work with us to make that happen, as opposed to, shutting us out of the conversation completely. And it will assist with mental health. It will assist with, youth creativity. It will assist with all these things that we care about: community, gathering people from different perspectives, all these sorts of things that we say that we want. Arts and the theater do that directly. And sure, yeah, we're all, obviously the performing arts was one of the first industries to close, and likely will be the last one to go back to its initial capacity. But there's so much we can do in the interim. And in some cases we just need a little bit of support right now, but ultimately we just need more of a collaborative, working together nature, as opposed to, yeah, keeping the doors closed and us having to bang at them just for them to pay attention to us.
And I was wondering, as far as Theatre by the Bay, how did it feel? Like, from what I could tell, it seemed like a huge groundswell of support that kind of emerged throughout this whole past couple of weeks. How has that felt for you and your colleagues?
It's been very empowering, I would say. Yeah, I mean, the groups like Theatre by the Bay and Kempenfeld Community Players and Talk is Free, we've been around for a long time. Like, Theatre by the Bay is reaching its 20th anniversary. So as an organization, we have seen just how much impact we've had. And for those people to, people from all walks of life to say, this is outrageous, we're behind you, we love what you're doing. Barrie isn't just a sports town. I like having arts and culture where I live. Like, these sorts of things are really empowering, and certainly got the message across. I mean, there was that great moment in council where, at the council meeting, where, Mayor Lehman was like, we got a lot of people, and that's just normal people doing that. Even before there was that communal push, people were just choosing to do that of themselves, and that is exactly the kind of support that we need to get our voice heard and to change the conversation.
And I want to be mindful of your time, but I have one last question, just about as far as operating during the pandemic. And I don't know if you're tired of answering this question, but how has that been for Theatre by the Bay? How has it been to kind of transition your operations, or change, or think about how you do stuff differently? What's that been like?
It's been extremely challenging, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we had, when everything was shut down initially last March, I guess, we were days away from announcing our 2020 season. We had cast and hired everyone for an entire show, and we're deep into development. And as a company that does new work, we've already put in potentially years of time into making these things happen. So seeing that having to just kind of be put on the shelf was really difficult. Fortunately, we got some good support right at the right time. So we had a Trillium grant that allowed us to do a lot of educational programming and move a lot of things online, which is a lifeblood rather. So that was good. But yeah, and then I had to throw out the 2021 season and completely start from scratch and work with people to work really quickly to make that all happen. So we knew, and also a season that could be adaptable, as it was like, okay, well, maybe we can do stuff by the summer. Nope. Okay. Maybe we can do stuff by the fall. Nope. Okay. And now we're looking at, September when everyone's vaccinated kind of thing, hopefully. So it's been challenging. And the reason that people go into theater isn't for the money. Certainly it's not for the money. It's for the love of the art. And when you're not getting to make the art, it puts so much strain on everything else that you're doing. So it's been difficult, but fortunately we have a really great team. I have a fantastic board of directors that I work with, and so many local artists that are willing to just pour in their time and their creativity, even as they undergo so much mental stress to make stuff happen next year and in future years. So yeah, that's been amazing. But it's tough. It's tough right now.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I just wanted to thank you as well for taking the time to talk with me about all this. And I think that's all the questions I have for now.
Great. Yeah, anytime.
Awesome.
I'm always happy to chat.
Thanks for watching this video. Next up, we speak to two members of Barrie's theater community on what the Georgian means to them.